A single green indicator glows above the hatch of an Imperial transport, its light reflecting across polished black armor that seems to swallow everything around it. This engine's hum with the steady rhythm of a Class 546 cruiser drifting through the darkness between stars while inside no one speaks, in a voice you can understand. Only bursts of distorted static rise from the helmets of the soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder, encrypted syllables transformed into cold mechanical whispers. No names are exchanged. No nervous laughter breaks the silence before deployment. There is only discipline so complete that it almost feels unnatural, as if these figures stopped being ordinary people long before they stepped aboard this vessel. As you settle in and let the sound of this story carry you towards sleep, tonight's journey explores the untold story of the Death Troopers and the hidden world of Imperial black operations, where the Empire concealed some of its darkest secrets in plain sight. If you've joined these stories before, quietly note which night you've reached. If this is your first, simply call it Night 1. The hatch remains sealed, and beyond it stretches a galaxy that believes it understands the military power of the Galactic Empire. Citizens recognize white-armored stormtroopers marching through occupied streets. Rebel spies memorize the silhouettes of Imperial-class star destroyers and the terrifying outline of the Death Star. Even children on distant Outer Rim worlds know the deep breathing of Darth Vader, whose reputation spreads faster than any official proclamation. Yet hidden behind all of those familiar symbols exists another layer of the Empire, one that rarely appears in public records or triumphant propaganda hollows. That hidden layer is where our story begins, because the Empire never trusted visible power alone. It also relied upon fear that remained unseen. Why did Emperor Palpatine build secret armies when he already commanded millions of soldiers? The question becomes even more intriguing when you consider the scale of Imperial military strength after the end of the Clone Wars in 19 BBY. The clone army that had served the Galactic Republic became the foundation of a new Imperial military, while recruitment expanded across countless worlds until ordinary citizens filled the ranks of stormtrooper legions. Enormous shipyards at places such as Kuat and Fondor constructed star destroyers in numbers the Old Republic had never imagined. The Imperial Navy projected overwhelming force across the core worlds, the colonies, and the mid-rim alike, making open resistance appear hopeless. By every measurable standard, Palpatine already possessed the largest military machine in galactic history, yet the Emperor continued creating organizations that existed almost entirely in the shadows. To understand that decision, you first have to understand the man who declared himself Emperor. Palpatine had spent decades hiding his true identity as Darth Sidious while manipulating both the Galactic Senate and the Jedi Order without either side discovering the complete truth. He orchestrated the Clone Wars by directing both the Republic and the Confederacy of independent systems at the same time, allowing conflict itself to become his greatest weapon. When Order 66 was executed, the Jedi were caught almost completely by surprise because secrecy had protected the Sith more effectively than any fleet ever could. That lesson never left him. Open displays of military strength won battles, but hidden knowledge won empires. It is difficult to imagine Palpatine abandoning the methods that had already brought him absolute power. As the Empire replaced the Republic, familiar institutions changed their purpose without always changing their appearance. The Senate continued meeting for years after the Republic fell, although its authority steadily diminished until Palpatine dissolved it shortly before the Battle of Yavin in 0 BBY. Governors known as Moffs and later Grand Moffs received authority over entire sectors, bypassing many of the older political traditions. The Imperial Security Bureau, commonly called the ISB, expanded into an organization devoted not simply to law enforcement, but to surveillance, ideological control, and the identification of even the smallest signs of dissent. Imperial intelligence gathered information across the galaxy with equal determination, monitoring political leaders, smugglers, industrial corporations, and suspected rebel sympathizers alike. The Empire wanted to know everything before anyone else did. Information became another battlefield, and silence became another weapon. That philosophy shaped every level of Imperial rule. Stormtroopers marched openly through city streets because they were meant to be seen, their white armor impossible to ignore against the gray architecture of Imperial occupation. TIE fighters screamed overhead not only to patrol, but to remind entire populations that resistance carried consequences. Massive star destroyers emerged from hyperspace, above worlds that had committed no crime beyond entertaining dangerous ideas. Fear was never accidental. Grand Moff Wilhuff, Tarkin expressed this principle clearly when he explained that rule through the fear of force would keep systems obedient, even before the Death Star itself demonstrated what that doctrine truly meant. The visible empire frightened ordinary citizens, but the invisible empire frightened those who believed they understood how imperial power actually worked. Why then did certain imperial officers disappear from official schedules without explanation? Records inside the imperial hierarchy occasionally mention personnel transferred under classified authority, assignments that bypassed ordinary chains of command, or facilities whose security clearance exceeded even that of experienced admirals. Director Orson Krennic, the ambitious head of the Advanced Weapons Research Division, commanded extraordinary authority while overseeing Project Stardust, the construction of the Death Star. His work remained hidden behind layers of secrecy so extensive that many Imperial officers knew almost nothing about the station until it entered service. Research facilities on Edu operated beneath relentless storms that concealed both laboratories and transportation routes. Scientists, engineers, technicians, and security personnel all understood that knowledge itself had become dangerous. The closer someone moved toward the Empire's greatest secrets, the fewer people even knew they existed. There was another figure who rarely needed introductions within these classified circles. Darth Vader carried no formal military rank above every officer in the Empire, yet few questioned his authority when he arrived aboard an Imperial vessel. Admirals, generals, and governors recognized that Vader answered directly to Emperor Palpatine, placing him outside ordinary bureaucratic structures. His flagship, the Executor, would later become the most feared vessel in the Imperial Navy. But even before its construction, Vader moved freely between fleets, research stations, and intelligence operations. He represented something beyond military command. Where Vader appeared, secrecy often followed. Where secrecy gathered, ordinary soldiers frequently disappeared from view. For listeners who know the great battles of the Galactic Civil War, this raises an interesting inconsistency. The famous moments are filled with recognizable faces and familiar uniforms. At the Battle of Scarif, Rebel commandos assault the Citadel Tower while Imperial stormtroopers defend its halls. During the escape from the first Death Star, white armored soldiers fill every corridor. On Hoth, ranks of snowtroopers advance across frozen ground beneath the shadow of AT-AT walkers. The Empire seemed content to let conventional forces fight its public wars. Yet scattered across official reports and surviving accounts are brief appearances by soldiers dressed entirely in black, standing beside the Empire's most closely guarded leaders. Their presence is so unusual that every appearance invites another question. Those rare sightings were never accidents. The Empire assigned its most sensitive missions to forces that differed from ordinary stormtroopers in equipment, training, and purpose. Some guarded individuals instead of territory. Others secured research installations instead of battlefronts. Their armor carried advanced sensor arrays, specialized communications equipment, and modifications not seen among standard infantry. Even their voices emerged through encrypted processors that disguised every spoken word from anyone lacking proper authorization. To an outside observer, the effect was unsettling. Instead of hearing human speech, you heard fragments of metallic distortion, as though language itself had become classified. The Empire wanted these soldiers to be remembered, if they were remembered at all, as something almost beyond humanity. This approach reflected a larger truth about Imperial government. Palpatine never built only one system of authority. He created overlapping organizations whose responsibilities intersected just enough that each watched the others as carefully as they watched the galaxy. The Imperial Navy observed military threats. The ISB observed citizens and officers alike. Imperial intelligence gathered secrets across borders and within ministries. Darth Vader answered only to the Emperor. Such deliberate overlap discouraged conspiracy because no institution trusted another completely. Every ambitious official understood that somewhere beyond their vision stood another observer collecting reports for the throne on Coruscant. So we return to that silent transport drifting through darkness, where the green light still burns above the sealed hatch and the armored figures remain perfectly still. Outside, stars pass without sound, scattered across the black expanse like distant lanterns whose light has traveled for centuries. Inside, the soldiers neither shift their weight nor exchange reassuring words before the mission ahead. Their encrypted voices remain little more than mechanical echoes carried through sophisticated helmet systems, impossible for outsiders to decipher. Before we discover who these silent guardians truly are, we first have to understand why the Empire believed secrecy itself could become its most powerful weapon. Only then do the black armored figures waiting behind that sealed hatch begin to make sense. Why were the Death Troopers created when the Empire already possessed elite stormtrooper formations, Imperial commandos, and countless specialized units? The answer begins with a simple observation that appears again and again across Imperial history. Whenever Emperor Palpatine considered a project too valuable to risk, ordinary military procedures quietly disappeared. The Death Star was not protected like an ordinary fleet installation. Imperial intelligence did not operate like the line army. Darth Vader rarely relied upon the same officers twice if they failed him. The closer one moved toward the Emperor's greatest ambitions, the more the familiar structure of the Imperial military gave way to something far more selective and far more secretive. By the years immediately preceding the Battle of Yavin, the Imperial military had become astonishingly diverse. Standard stormtrooper legions served aboard star destroyers and occupied worlds from Coruscant to Lothal. Scout troopers specialized in reconnaissance across forests, deserts, and frozen terrain. Shore troopers defended Imperial coastal installations such as those later seen on Scarif, where mobility in tropical conditions mattered more than heavy armor. Tank troopers, snow troopers, patrol troopers, and specialized naval security forces each filled carefully defined roles. None of these units existed by accident. Imperial doctrine valued specialization because every environment demanded a different kind of soldier. Yet even among this expanding catalog of elite formations, one group remained noticeably separate. The first thing anyone noticed about a Death Trooper was not his weapon or his rank, it was the armor. Unlike the bright white plastoid plates worn by ordinary stormtroopers, Death Trooper armor absorbed light rather than reflecting it, appearing almost featureless in dim corridors. Canon reference guides describe the armor as incorporating sophisticated sensor suites, environmental filters, tactical displays, encrypted communications equipment, and enhanced targeting systems integrated directly into the helmet. The black finish served more than aesthetic purpose. During nighttime operations or inside poorly illuminated Imperial facilities, the soldiers blended naturally into shadow while retaining full battlefield awareness through advanced optics invisible to the naked eye. The Empire had dressed fear itself in black. Another detail puzzled Imperial observers who encountered them for the first time. Death Troopers rarely removed their helmets while on assignment, even in supposedly secure environments. Their speech reached nearby personnel only after passing through encrypted voice scramblers that transformed recognizable language into bursts of electronic distortion. In Rogue One, director Orson Krennic receives these garbled transmissions without hesitation, implying that authorized personnel either possessed decryption equipment or had become accustomed to interpreting the encoded signals through internal communications. To everyone else, the soldiers sounded less like human beings than machines exchanging incomprehensible commands. The effect was psychological as much as practical. A soldier whose words cannot be understood becomes strangely distant, impossible to read, and difficult to humanize. Who stood inside those black suits? Canon provides a surprisingly clear foundation, while still leaving enough silence for thoughtful interpretation. Death Troopers were recruited from the Empire's finest stormtroopers after demonstrating exceptional combat ability, physical endurance, and unwavering loyalty. They did not begin life as a separate branch of the military. Instead, they represented the highest tier within an already demanding profession, selected only after surviving years of Imperial service. The Empire invested enormous resources into each candidate because replacing one was neither quick nor inexpensive. Every death trooper became an asset measured differently from ordinary infantry. Losing one meant more than losing a soldier. It meant losing years of training and classified knowledge. Imperial training itself had changed dramatically since the final days of the Clone Wars. During the Republic, clone troopers had matured on Kamino under the supervision of the Kaminoan cloners and instructors such as the ARC Trooper Alpha 17, receiving standardized military education from childhood. After the Empire shifted toward human recruitment, training academies appeared throughout Imperial space. Worlds like Karita became synonymous with harsh military discipline, producing officers and enlisted personnel capable of serving across every branch of the Imperial war machine. Young recruits endured relentless physical conditioning, live-fire exercises, survival instruction, and ideological education reinforcing loyalty to the new order. Death Trooper candidates emerged from this already demanding environment before advancing into programs far beyond the experience of ordinary graduates. What exactly happened inside those advanced programs remains one of canon's most intriguing silences. Official reference material confirms that Death Troopers underwent extensive physical enhancement and classified medical treatment intended to maximize combat performance. Their height alone often exceeded that of standard stormtroopers, contributing to their intimidating presence beside Imperial officers. Enhanced strength, stamina, reaction speed, and endurance allowed them to perform missions that exhausted conventional infantry. Canon does not fully describe every procedure, and that absence has encouraged years of discussion among readers. The important distinction remains clear. These were not experimental monsters created in laboratories. They were already exceptional soldiers refined into something even more formidable through controlled Imperial science. Some fans naturally connect those enhancements with much darker Imperial research. That idea deserves careful separation between canon and speculation. Canon firmly establishes that the Empire conducted advanced biological experimentation under numerous research divisions, especially during the reign of Palpatine, and later projects involving figures such as Dr. Pershing explored cloning and genetic science during the era of Imperial remnants. Separately, canon confirms that Death Troopers received classified augmentations, enhancing battlefield capability. A popular fan theory suggests these broader research programs shared knowledge or personnel, gradually creating a network of military science serving multiple secret initiatives. The evidence does not confirm that connection outright, but the possibility fits comfortably within the Empire's demonstrated willingness to sacrifice ethics whenever military advantage beckoned. Their equipment reflected the same philosophy of relentless refinement. Death Troopers carried the E-11D blaster rifle, an improved variant of the standard E-11 familiar to ordinary stormtroopers. The weapon offered greater accuracy, increased stopping power, and improved performance during prolonged engagements, qualities essential for operators expected to fight independently against highly trained opponents. Many also carried SE-14RR light-repeating blasters as secondary weapons, thermal detonators, and mission-specific equipment selected according to operational needs. Their armor incorporated magnetic attachment points, integrated power systems, and communications arrays unavailable to conventional units. Every component emphasized efficiency. Nothing existed for ceremonial display. Perhaps the greatest difference lay not in equipment, but in expectation. A standard stormtrooper formed one element within a much larger formation, relying upon squad tactics, overwhelming numbers, and coordinated support from armored vehicles or starfighters. Death troopers frequently operated in remarkably small teams, often numbering no more than a handful of soldiers, accompanying a single high-value individual. Their training encouraged initiative without sacrificing discipline, allowing them to respond instantly when circumstances shifted. During close protection assignments, they continuously scanned entrances, rooftops, windows, and surrounding crowds while maintaining precise formation around their objective. Every movement suggested rehearsals repeated thousands of times until instinct replaced conscious thought. That discipline becomes unmistakable during director Orson Krennic's introduction in Rogue One. As Krennic lands on Lahmu to confront Galen Erso, the death troopers surrounding him do not spread randomly across the moisture farm. They establish overlapping fields of observation, covering avenues of approach, while Krennic conducts the conversation himself. Galen Erso remains the primary objective. Lyra Erso's unexpected resistance is answered immediately, while young Jin escapes into the surrounding landscape only because circumstances fracture the operation at precisely the wrong moment. Even then, the Death Troopers remain focused upon protecting Krennic rather than pursuing every possible target. They behave exactly as elite protective specialists are trained to behave. As the Imperial shuttle lifts away from Lahmu with Galen Erso aboard, the black-armored soldiers disappear into its shadowed interior almost as silently as they arrived. They leave behind a grieving child, a dead mother, and a scientist whose knowledge will eventually determine the fate of the Empire itself. At first glance, they seem to have completed an ordinary security mission. Yet every choice they made reveals something larger. These soldiers were never intended to win fame through spectacular victories. They existed to preserve the Emperor's most valuable secrets, one mission at a time, long before the rest of the galaxy even realized those secrets existed. Why did director Orson Krennic, one of the most powerful men in the Empire, receive an escort unlike any other Imperial official? His position alone offers part of the answer. As Director of Advanced Weapons Research, Krennic supervised Project Stardust, the decades-long effort that transformed the Geonosian concept of a planet-killing battle station into the completed Death Star. Every stage of that project depended upon absolute secrecy. Scientists worked without understanding the entire design. Shipyards fabricated components that would never be assembled in one location until the final stages. Even members of the Imperial High Command remained unaware of the station's true purpose until shortly before its completion. Protecting Krennic meant protecting knowledge that Palpatine considered more valuable than entire fleets. The Death Star itself had an unusually long history before the galaxy first saw its gray silhouette emerge from hyperspace above Jeddah. During the Clone Wars, Count Dooku recovered the original Geonosian plans after the First Battle of Geonosis and carried them to Darth Sidious. The Geonosians, led by Archduke Poggle the Lesser, possessed engineering concepts that envisioned a moon-sized battle station capable of concentrating immense destructive energy into a single super laser. After the rise of the Empire, construction quietly began, first above Geonosis and later at other hidden locations as the project expanded. Entire industrial worlds contributed materials without fully understanding what they were building. The scale became so vast that no single factory could comprehend the finished machine. Because secrecy mattered above everything else, Geonosis itself became a cautionary example of Imperial ruthlessness. Canon establishes that after the Geonosians had fulfilled their role in the Death Star project, nearly the entire species was exterminated under Imperial orders. By the time the Ghost Crew investigated the planet during the years before the Battle of Yavin, its once thriving hive cities had fallen silent. Only a handful of survivors remained, including the drone later known simply as Click-Clack, who carefully protected what appeared to be the last surviving Geonosian queen egg. The Empire had erased an entire civilization to preserve one military secret. Against that backdrop, assigning the Death Troopers to Krennic begins to feel less excessive and more inevitable. When Krennic appears on screen, the contrast between him and his escorts is deliberate. His pristine white director's uniform marks him as an ambitious administrator who rose through technical expertise and political maneuvering rather than battlefield glory. Around him stand towering figures in black, whose faces remain permanently hidden behind opaque lenses. Krennic speaks freely, negotiates, threatens, and occasionally allows frustration to show. The Death Troopers reveal almost nothing at all. Their silence reinforces his authority while simultaneously reminding every observer that his importance comes directly from Imperial confidence. A man guarded by soldiers, this unusual must be protecting something extraordinary. Their role becomes even clearer during Krennic's repeated visits to Imperial facilities. On Iedu, where violent storms crash endlessly against towering research platforms, the Death Troopers accompany him through laboratories containing scientists responsible for solving the Death Star's engineering challenges. Galen Erso works there under constant supervision, refining calculations that will stabilize the station's Kyber crystal-powered super laser. Vast archives store research accumulated over many years, while shielded landing platforms receive shuttles carrying personnel cleared for only the highest security levels. Ordinary stormtroopers protect the installation's perimeter alongside Imperial Army units, but the Death Troopers remain close to Krennic himself. Their assignment is not to defend every building. Their assignment is to ensure that the project's leadership survives. Why did Galen Erso remain alive when so many others connected to the project disappeared? The answer reveals another layer of Imperial thinking. Galen was not merely another engineer. He possessed rare expertise in energy systems and Kyber crystal applications that even the Empire struggled to replace. Krennic repeatedly insisted that Galen's work was indispensable, tolerating the scientist's reluctance because completing the super laser mattered more than punishing quiet resistance. The Death Troopers surrounding Krennic therefore protected a relationship built upon coercion rather than loyalty. Every meeting with Galen balanced persuasion, intimidation, and the unspoken reality that escape remained impossible. This also explains why the Empire's security system never relied upon a single solution. On Iadu, sensor arrays monitored approaching spacecraft, while TIE fighters stood ready inside nearby hangars. Ground forces occupied defensive positions throughout the mountain complex, supported by armored vehicles and heavy weapons. Imperial communications linked the installation directly with higher command, ensuring that any intrusion could trigger rapid reinforcement. Yet, layered above all of these conventional measures stood Krennic's personal escort. If the base itself came under attack, the Death Troopers would remain focused upon protecting the individual whose knowledge could not be replaced overnight. Their combat doctrine reflected this specialized purpose. Rather than advancing in broad firing lines like conventional stormtroopers, Death Troopers frequently fought as compact elements, moving with disciplined spacing that allowed overlapping fields of fire without sacrificing mobility. During engagements, they communicated almost continuously through encrypted helmet systems, exchanging tactical information without exposing intentions to enemy listeners. Canon reference materials emphasize their advanced optics and battlefield awareness, advantages that allowed them to identify threats quickly in cluttered or low-visibility environments. Watching them in motion reveals very little wasted movement. Each step appears measured long before the operation begins. One subtle detail in Rogue One often passes unnoticed during a first viewing. As Krennic walks through Imperial installations, the Death Troopers rarely look directly at him for extended periods. Instead, their attention constantly sweeps entrances, elevated positions, nearby personnel, and possible firing angles. This behavior mirrors real close protection doctrine. The principal does not need additional eyes watching him. He needs professionals searching for everyone else. Their discipline allows Krennic to focus entirely upon political negotiations and scientific progress because they have already accepted responsibility for every other danger in the room. Were these soldiers feared even inside the Imperial military? Canon quietly suggests they were. During interactions between Death Troopers and ordinary personnel, there is little sign of casual familiarity. Officers acknowledge them professionally, but friendships never appear. Stormtroopers do not exchange conversation with them while waiting for deployment. Naval crews continue their duties as the black armored figures pass without interruption. This emotional distance serves the Empire well. An isolated security force is less vulnerable to divided loyalties, gossip, or compromise. The fewer personal connections these operatives formed, the more completely they belonged to the mission. Outside the Empire, however, rumors inevitably spread. Rebel intelligence gathered fragments rather than complete pictures. Agents learned that certain Imperial officials always traveled with unusually equipped guards. Survivors occasionally described black armored stormtroopers whose voices sounded mechanical and whose marksmanship exceeded that of ordinary Imperial infantry. Such reports reached Alliance intelligence alongside countless other observations collected from smugglers, defectors, senators, and local resistance groups. Yet information remained incomplete. Few rebels had encountered the Death Troopers directly and lived long enough to provide detailed testimony. Like so much within Palpatine's government, certainty remained frustratingly out of reach. The calm before the Battle of Scarif is built upon these years of hidden preparation. Krennic believes his project is nearing triumph. Galen Erso quietly engineers the flaw that only he fully understands. Imperial intelligence hunts scattered rebel cells across the galaxy, unaware that one stolen message from the pilot Bodhi Rook will soon begin unraveling decades of secrecy. Standing beside Krennic through every inspection and every classified conference are the same silent, black-armored guardians, watching the corridors illuminated by sterile white light, while rain lashes the windows of Eadu beyond. Their greatest test has not yet arrived, but the current carrying them towards Scarif has already begun. Why did Scarif receive security unlike any other Imperial installation in the galaxy? At first glance, the tropical world appears almost peaceful. Brilliant blue oceans surround white beaches, palm-like vegetation bends beneath warm coastal winds, and sunlight reflects across enormous shield gates suspended in orbit. Yet beneath that calm surface stood one of the Empire's most heavily protected archives. Scarif served as the Imperial Security Complex, a repository for classified research stretching far beyond the Death Star alone. Countless vaults stored military projects, weapons research, intelligence reports, engineering records, and technical data gathered over decades of Imperial expansion. Destroying a Star Destroyer would hurt the Empire. Losing Scarif's archives threatened knowledge that could never be reconstructed. The orbital defense reflected that importance. Rather than relying solely upon planetary garrisons, Scarif existed beneath a massive planetary shield generated by an orbital shield gate. Every vessel entering or leaving required authorization through tightly controlled traffic procedures. Star Destroyers maintained patrol positions beyond the gate while TIE fighters remained ready for rapid interception. The shield itself transformed the planet into something resembling an island fortress. Even if an enemy fleet discovered Scarif's location, reaching the surface demanded passing through one of the most sophisticated defensive systems ever built by the Empire. It was security designed not merely to repel invasion but to discourage the attempt entirely. On the ground, Scarif combined beauty with relentless order. Wide causeways connected research towers above shallow tropical waters, while endless rows of data vaults extended beneath reinforced structures, protected from both attack and environmental damage. Engineers, technicians, naval officers, communications specialists, and security personnel moved according to carefully controlled schedules. Cargo shuttles arrived carrying classified equipment from worlds across Imperial space before departing again with almost no public record of their destinations. Every clearance code mattered. Every access terminal logged movement. Every restricted corridor reminded visitors that information itself had become the Empire's most valuable resource. Among those countless records rested the complete technical archive for Project Stardust. Galen Erso's reactor calculations, structural engineering reports, Kyber crystal research, thermal regulation systems, exhaust port schematics, construction schedules documenting work performed across multiple shipyards and industrial worlds. Every stage of the Death Star's creation ultimately converged within Scarif's archives. Krennic understood this better than anyone because his own career had become inseparable from those files. If someone stole them, the Empire risked exposing years of hidden work. If someone destroyed them, rebuilding that knowledge would require enormous time and resources. Scarif protected memory as much as machinery. Why then did the Rebel Alliance decide to attack what seemed like an impregnable fortress? The answer begins on Yavin 4. After Jyn Erso delivers her father's message to the Rebel leadership, Galen reveals that he deliberately engineered a fatal weakness into the Death Star's reactor system, hidden so carefully that no one except its creator could identify it. To exploit that weakness, the Alliance needed the station's technical schematics stored on Scarif. The Rebel Council hesitated. Senators, generals, and military leaders recognized that launching an assault against Scarif bordered on suicide. Without proof, they risked sacrificing ships, soldiers, and perhaps the Alliance itself. The debate nearly ended the mission before it began. Cassian Andor refused to let the opportunity disappear. A veteran intelligence officer who had spent years conducting dangerous covert operations for the Alliance, Cassian understood that wars often turned upon decisions made long before conventional armies entered the battlefield. Alongside Jyn Erso, K2SO, Chirrut Imwe, Baze Malbus, Bodhi Rook, and a small volunteer force later known as Rogue One, he departed Yavin without official authorization. Their objective remained astonishingly narrow. They were not sent to conquer Scarif or destroy the Imperial archives. They needed only enough time to locate one set of plans and transmit them into orbit. The mission depended upon precision rather than overwhelming force. The Death Troopers entered the battle exactly where Imperial planners intended. When Krennic arrived on Scarif after learning that Galen Erso had died during the rebel attack on Eadu, his escort accompanied him into the Citadel Tower where the Death Star plans remained secured. Unlike the stormtroopers spread throughout beaches, landing platforms, and defensive positions, the Death Troopers concentrated around the archive itself and the senior official responsible for it. Their mission never changed, despite the growing chaos outside. Every blaster exchange along Scarif's shoreline mattered less than protecting the tower's command structure. If Krennic survived and the archives remained secure, Imperial Command believed the crisis could still be contained. Watching the battle unfold reveals the distinct way Death Troopers fought. They moved rapidly through the tower's corridors, coordinating through encrypted communications, while responding to constantly changing intelligence. When Cassian Andor and Jyn Erso penetrated deeper into the archive, the Death Troopers closed the distance with disciplined aggression instead of reckless pursuit. They understood the terrain, secured intersections, and forced the rebels to fight under relentless pressure. Ordinary stormtroopers often relied upon numbers. The Death Troopers relied upon precision. Each burst from an E-11D blaster carried deliberate intent rather than suppressive volume alone. K2SO's sacrifice demonstrates how narrow the rebels' margin truly became. The reprogrammed Imperial security droid held the archive entrance against advancing stormtroopers until overwhelming firepower destroyed him. His final actions delayed Imperial forces just long enough for Jyn and Cassian to locate the Death Star plans stored under the designation Stardust. Every passing second increased the likelihood that Death Troopers or additional reinforcements would overrun the tower. The archive itself became less a building than a clock, steadily counting toward failure. Few operations in galactic Civil War history balanced success and disaster so delicately. Outside, the battle expanded beyond anyone's original expectations. Admiral Raddus arrived with the rebel fleet after realizing Rogue One had already committed itself, bringing MC-75 cruisers, starfighters, and transports into combat above Scarif. Imperial Star Destroyers responded immediately, while the planetary shield prevented easy escape. Gold Squadron and Blue Squadron fought desperately against TIE fighters as Hammerhead Corvette Lightmaker executed the remarkable maneuver that pushed one disabled Star Destroyer into another, clearing a path through the shield gate. Every engagement in orbit influenced the battle below. Without space superiority, transmitting the plans would accomplish nothing. Without success, inside the Citadel Tower, victory in orbit would become meaningless. Did the Death Troopers fail on Scarif? The answer depends entirely upon perspective. They accomplished nearly every tactical objective expected of them. They defended Krennic through most of the battle. They pursued the infiltrators relentlessly. They forced Cassian and Jyn into increasingly desperate decisions. They delayed the theft of the plans until only moments remained before Imperial reinforcements overwhelmed the tower. The rebels succeeded not because the Death Troopers performed poorly, but because dozens of unlikely events aligned at precisely the right time across both the surface and space above the planet. As the transmission carrying the Death Star schematics finally leaves the Citadel Tower and races toward Admiral Raddus's flagship, the tropical air fills with smoke drifting above shattered walkways and burning palm trees. Below, black-armored figures continue advancing through corridors that are already becoming irrelevant. The information they were created to protect has slipped beyond their reach by only a handful of seconds. They cannot know it yet, but those few seconds will echo through every battle that follows, carrying consequences far greater than anyone standing on Scarif can possibly imagine. Why did Darth Vader arrive at Scarif only after the battle was already nearing its end? The timing has invited discussion ever since Rogue One first revealed those final moments before the opening of A New Hope. Canon never suggests that Vader commanded the defense of Scarif itself. Responsibility for Project Stardust belonged to director Orson Krennic, while the planetary garrison answered through the established Imperial military hierarchy. Vader entered the crisis only after the Emperor's greatest secret had already been compromised. His mission was no longer to defend Scarif. It was to recover what had escaped. Even before his arrival, Vader occupied a unique place inside the Imperial command structure. Officers addressed him with respect, mixed unmistakably with fear, because his authority did not depend upon conventional rank. Grand Moff Tarkin could command fleets through political office. Admirals controlled naval task forces. Generals directed planetary campaigns. Vader existed outside those boundaries, acting as the Emperor's personal instrument wherever Palpatine believed decisive intervention necessary. When he stepped aboard an Imperial vessel, existing chains of command bent around him almost automatically. No written regulation fully explained that authority. Experience did. His flagship, the Executor, would later become the most recognizable superstar destroyer of the Galactic Civil War. But during the events surrounding Scarif, Vader operated from the Imperial-class Star Destroyer Devastator. That vessel would become famous only hours later when it pursued the Rebel corvette Tantive IV above Tatooine. At Scarif, however, the Devastator represented the final layer of Imperial response. Fleets already engaged the rebels. Ground forces already defended the Archive. Death Troopers already fought inside the Citadel Tower. Vader's arrival signaled that the situation had escalated beyond ordinary military control. Why did Palpatine rely upon Vader for crises involving secrecy rather than assigning another Grand Moff or fleet commander? The answer reaches back to the final days of the Republic. Darth Sidious had trained Vader not merely as an apprentice in the Force, but as the executor of Sith will across the galaxy. Loyalty, from Palpatine's perspective, could never rest entirely upon political ambition, because ambitious officials eventually pursued power for themselves. Vader possessed ambition once as Anakin Skywalker, yet the fall to the dark side had reshaped that ambition into absolute devotion to his master. Imperial officers might compete, deceive, or seek advancement. Vader sought only the Emperor's objectives. For operations where failure carried catastrophic consequences, Palpatine preferred certainty over popularity. The relationship between Vader and the Death Troopers illustrates another interesting aspect of Imperial organization. Canon shows the black-armored soldiers accompanying Vader during certain missions, particularly where classified objectives demanded elite security, yet they never replaced his other trusted forces entirely. The Emperor's Royal Guard remained associated primarily with Palpatine himself. The 501st Legion, whose lineage stretched back through Anakin Skywalker's clone unit during the Clone Wars, continued serving Vader in various capacities after the transition to the Empire. Stormtrooper detachments routinely supported his campaigns as well. The Death Troopers, therefore, formed one tool among several, reserved for circumstances where extraordinary protection or operational precision outweighed conventional military strength. This distinction mattered because Vader approached warfare differently from most Imperial commanders. Admirals calculated fleet formations. Governors worried about political stability. Intelligence officers evaluated probability and risk. Vader habitually moved toward the center of unfolding events, believing direct action could accomplish what prolonged planning often could not. His pursuit of surviving Jedi demonstrates this pattern throughout the years following Order 66. Rather than delegating every hunt, he frequently confronted dangerous opponents himself, trusting both his lightsaber mastery and his command of the Force. Elite escorts existed to support that style of leadership rather than replace it. By the time the Devastator intercepted the escaping rebel fleet after Scarif, events had compressed into minutes. Admiral Radiss's flagship Profundity had successfully received the Death Star plans transmitted from the Citadel Tower. Rebel boarding teams fought desperately inside damaged corridors, while Imperial Marines attempted to regain control. Vader personally led the assault through smoke-filled passageways illuminated by emergency lighting, creating one of the most memorable scenes in modern Star Wars canon. Blaster bolts filled the narrow corridor, the crimson blade of his lightsaber carved through darkness. Every second mattered because the plans were moving steadily farther from his grasp. One remarkable detail often disappears beneath the spectacle of that sequence. Vader himself did not carry the responsibility of searching every compartment aboard the Profundity. Imperial troops secured territory, while specialized personnel pursued specific objectives. This division of labor reflected standard Imperial doctrine even during extraordinary operations. The commander focused upon the decisive point. Supporting forces contained resistance, guarded access routes, and prevented escape. It is entirely consistent with established Imperial practice that elite units, including death troopers assigned to classified missions, would secure sensitive areas, while Vader concentrated on the objective that required his unique abilities. Could death troopers have participated in portions of this pursuit outside the moments directly shown on screen? Canon neither confirms nor denies their presence aboard every vessel involved after Scarif. What it does establish is that they regularly protected individuals, installations, and operations connected with the Empire's most closely guarded secrets. Since the Death Star plans remained exactly such a secret, many viewers naturally infer that surviving Death Trooper detachments continued serving within the broader recovery effort. That interpretation fits comfortably within canon without requiring events that the films never depict. It is a reminder that the camera reveals only fragments of much larger military operations unfolding simultaneously. The famous handoff aboard the Tantive 4 captures how close the Empire came to preserving its greatest advantage. Princess Leia Organa receives the data moments before Darth Vader breaches the Corvette's entrance. Captain Ramos Antilles and the ship's defenders delay Imperial borders only briefly before overwhelming force reaches the command corridor. Leia entrusts the plans to R2-D2, accompanied by C-3PO, sending the astromech toward an escape pod that Imperial scanners ignore because it carries no life forms. Vader misses the plans not by hours or even minutes, but by seconds. Across Scarif, the Profundity, and the Tantive 4, the Empire repeatedly came within arm's reach of victory. What makes that sequence remarkable is not Imperial incompetence, but Imperial efficiency. Krennic delayed the rebels on Scarif. Death troopers nearly intercepted Jyn and Cassian. The planetary shield almost trapped the rebel fleet. Vader captured the Profundity. Imperial borders seized the Tantive 4. At nearly every stage, the Empire succeeded tactically. Yet strategy sometimes turns upon one surviving courier, one hidden compartment, or one overlooked escape pod drifting silently into the darkness above Tatooine. The machinery of Imperial power functioned almost perfectly. History simply demanded perfection, and almost proved insufficient. As the Devastator looms over the tiny Corvette fleeing toward the desert world below, the echoes of encrypted Death Trooper voices seem to fade behind the louder sounds of engines, alarms, and blaster fire. Their mission to guard the Emperor's greatest secret has failed, despite extraordinary discipline and unwavering obedience. The plans now rest inside a small astromech droid crossing the sands of Tatooine, carried far beyond the reach of every black-armored guardian who spent years ensuring those files would never leave Imperial hands. Their story, however, does not end with Scarif, because the Empire's hidden wars extended far beyond the Death Star alone. Why did the Empire invest so heavily in secret operations when open military force already dominated most of the galaxy? The answer becomes clearer if you step away from famous battles and instead follow the quieter conflicts that unfolded between them. The galactic civil war was not fought only at Yavin, Hoth, Endor, or Scarif. Long before rebel fleets challenged Imperial star destroyers in open space, countless local resistance movements emerged on isolated worlds, hidden moons, mining colonies, and industrial sectors. Most disappeared before they ever reached the attention of the wider alliance. The Empire intended to keep it that way. The Imperial Security Bureau occupied the center of that hidden struggle. Introduced in canon through works such as Andor and Rebels, the ISB functioned far beyond the responsibilities of ordinary law enforcement. Its officers monitored political loyalty, investigated sabotage, tracked suspected dissidents, and evaluated security failures throughout Imperial space. Inside the White Conference Room on Coruscant, seen in Andor, supervisors debated patterns rather than isolated crimes. One stolen payroll, one missing shipment of military equipment, one unexplained communication blackout. Standing alone, each incident seemed insignificant. Viewed together, they revealed the outline of rebellion beginning to spread beneath the Empire's notice. Major Partagaz, who oversaw the ISB's Strategic Analysis Division, understood this danger with remarkable clarity. Rather than reacting emotionally to every attack, he searched for relationships connecting apparently unrelated events. Dedra Miro reached similar conclusions when she argued that scattered thefts across multiple sectors reflected coordination rather than coincidence. The Empire's bureaucracy often rewarded rigid thinking, yet officers like Partagaz recognized that successful insurgencies rarely announced themselves openly. They grew quietly until enough separate acts formed a recognizable pattern. By then, suppressing them required far greater effort. The Death Troopers fit naturally into this environment because many ISB investigations eventually reached a point where conventional policing no longer sufficed. Canon rarely follows every classified mission, but the Empire's own structure makes the progression easy to understand. Intelligence officers identified a target, analysts verified the threat. Local authorities attempted arrests where possible. When operations involved highly classified technology, senior officials, or politically sensitive objectives, elite military support became necessary. Death Troopers represented the final physical expression of information gathered elsewhere. They arrived only after countless invisible steps had already taken place. One of the clearest examples of this broader Imperial strategy appears on Ferrix during the events of Andor. The Empire initially treats the industrial world as a routine security concern, managed through the Preox Morlana Corporate Authority. After Cassian Andor kills 2 corporate security officers, Imperial attention gradually intensifies. Eventually, the ISB assumes direct oversight, replacing corporate administration with Imperial control. Public executions are unnecessary. Bureaucratic expansion achieves the same result. Surveillance increases. Movement becomes restricted. Local customs disappear beneath regulations issued from Coruscant. Fear grows slowly rather than suddenly, making resistance more difficult to organize. Why did the Empire prefer infiltration over spectacle in so many of these operations? Public displays certainly had their place. The destruction of Alderaan demonstrated overwhelming power more vividly than any speech ever could. Yet spectacular violence also carried political cost. Entire sectors became harder to govern after witnessing such brutality. hidden operations offered another path. If resistance leaders vanished quietly, supply networks collapsed mysteriously, or informants disappeared without explanation, ordinary citizens often hesitated before joining underground movements. Uncertainty became an ally. People feared dangers they could not fully understand. Imperial intelligence complemented the ISB by looking outward while the Bureau increasingly looked inward. Intelligence agents gathered military information beyond Imperial borders, monitored criminal syndicates, evaluated alien governments, and penetrated organizations suspected of aiding the Rebel Alliance. The distinction between the two agencies sometimes blurred, especially during sensitive operations. One collected external secrets, the other protected internal stability. Both ultimately served Palpatine's determination to control information before anyone else possessed it. Together they formed a network extending across the known galaxy, from the gleaming towers of Coruscant to forgotten settlements at the edge of the Outer Rim. For elite military units, this meant assignments that ordinary stormtroopers rarely encountered. Imagine, not as invention contradicting canon, but as the natural consequence of Imperial doctrine, a classified laboratory requiring evacuation before Rebel forces arrived. Consider an ISB director transporting encrypted archives between secure facilities. Picture an ambitious Moff whose assassination would destabilize an entire sector already showing signs of rebellion. Canon establishes the organizations. It establishes the secrecy. It establishes the existence of specialized escorts. The individual missions often remain unwritten, but the pattern is unmistakable. The Empire built the Death Troopers precisely because such situations occurred again and again. Another fascinating glimpse into Imperial black operations comes through the Inquisitorius. Although the Imperial Inquisitors were Force-sensitive hunters trained to pursue surviving Jedi rather than conventional military officers, their existence reveals the Emperor's habit of constructing parallel organizations hidden from public view. The Fortress Inquisitorius on Nur operated under extraordinary secrecy, surrounded by water and protected against both conventional assault and infiltration. Most Imperial citizens never learned the fortress existed. Even many officers outside Vader's inner circle knew little about the Inquisitors themselves. Palpatine repeatedly divided dangerous responsibilities among isolated institutions that shared information only when absolutely necessary. This compartmentalization explains why failures rarely destroyed the Empire all at once. When the Death Star plans escaped Scarif, the ISB still functioned. Imperial intelligence continued collecting reports. Sector governors maintained authority. Shipyards kept producing Star Destroyers and TIE fighters. The Emperor viewed every institution as one layer within a much larger structure. If one layer cracked, another remained beneath it. This philosophy also made defeating the Empire extraordinarily difficult. Rebel victories often damaged individual branches while leaving the larger machine intact. The Rebel Alliance gradually learned to exploit the weaknesses hidden inside that complexity. Intelligence agents such as Cassian Andor and Luthen Rael recognized that isolated attacks rarely changed the course of the war. Instead, they sought opportunities forcing separate Imperial organizations to interfere with one another. Bureaucratic rivalry slowed investigations. Ambitious officers protected personal careers before sharing embarrassing information. Commanders feared Vader's anger enough to conceal mistakes until they became impossible to hide. The very secrecy that strengthened the Empire occasionally prevented its own institutions from cooperating effectively. Systems built upon distrust eventually struggled to trust themselves. Meanwhile, somewhere aboard another silent transport crossing hyperspace, black armored soldiers stood motionless as encrypted voices whispered through secure channels that no rebel slicer could intercept. They neither debated politics nor questioned strategy. Their responsibility began only after decisions had already been made by men seated in distant conference rooms on Coruscant. Yet those quiet conferences filled with maps, reports, and classified files shaped the fate of worlds just as surely as any battle fought beneath the guns of a Star Destroyer. The Death Troopers remained the Empire's final answer whenever secrecy alone was no longer enough and someone had to step out of the shadows to ensure that a secret stayed buried. Why did the Empire continue pouring resources into classified military science after the Death Star was already nearing completion? At first, the question seems almost unnecessary. A battle station capable of destroying an inhabited world appears to represent the ultimate weapon. Yet Emperor Palpatine never pursued only one path to dominance. Throughout his reign, the Empire funded overlapping research programs involving starship engineering, cybernetics, cloning, kyber crystal technology, advanced armor systems, and biological experimentation. The Death Star was the most visible achievement of that effort. It was never the only one. Imperial science inherited much from the final decades of the Republic. During the Clone Wars, Kamino had demonstrated the astonishing possibilities of large-scale genetic engineering by producing millions of clone troopers from the template of Jango Fett. Separatist factories perfected the mass production of battle droids on Geonosis, Metalorn, and other industrial worlds. Medical research accelerated as both sides searched for advantages capable of ending the war. When Palpatine transformed the Republic into the Empire, he inherited not only territory and fleets, but laboratories, research archives, and scientific expertise gathered across decades of conflict. Instead of dismantling that machinery, he expanded it. One of the clearest examples appears in the Empire's continuing fascination with cybernetics. Darth Vader himself became the most famous recipient of advanced prosthetic technology after his defeat on Mustafar in 19 BBY. His mechanical limbs, armored life support suit, neural interfaces, and respirator represented engineering far beyond ordinary civilian medicine. Canon repeatedly shows Imperial scientists refining artificial organs, replacement limbs, combat implants, and specialized life support systems. The Emperor understood that biology imposed limits. Technology could push beyond them. Every successful enhancement encouraged further experimentation elsewhere in the Imperial system. Did that philosophy influence the development of the Death Troopers? Canon answers part of the question directly. Official reference material confirms that Death Troopers underwent classified physical enhancements that increased their battlefield performance beyond conventional human capability. Their exceptional height, strength, stamina, and resilience did not arise through ordinary military conditioning alone. The precise methods remain classified within the universe itself, leaving deliberate gaps in the historical record. Those gaps have generated years of discussion because they exist, alongside the Empire's well-established willingness to reshape living bodies whenever military necessity demanded it. What we do not see can sometimes be just as revealing as what appears openly on screen. The Empire never stages public ceremonies celebrating its enhancement programs. Recruitment posters never advertise medical augmentation. Imperial officers rarely discuss these procedures during official briefings. That silence suggests the programs remained compartmentalized even within the military itself. A stormtrooper serving aboard an Imperial Star Destroyer might spend an entire career without learning exactly how Death Troopers were selected or transformed. Secrecy protected not only the finished soldiers but the process that created them. Mount Tantus offers another fascinating glimpse into the Emperor's scientific ambitions. During the era explored in the Bad Batch, the hidden Imperial installation became a center for highly classified cloning research under Dr. Royce Hemlock. There, captured clone troopers, force-sensitive specimens, and advanced genetic experiments served projects known only to a handful of senior Imperial officials. Emperor Palpatine personally monitored portions of this work because it intersected with goals extending far beyond ordinary military applications. Although Mount Tantus and the Death Trooper program are never explicitly connected in canon, they clearly reflect the same governing philosophy. Knowledge remained compartmentalized, dangerous, and controlled from the highest levels of Imperial authority. The same pattern appears in Project Necromancer, introduced during the era of Imperial remnants. Canon establishes that Palpatine pursued research into cloning and the preservation or transfer of consciousness, projects that ultimately connect with his return decades later on Exegol. These efforts belong to a different branch of Imperial science than battlefield enhancement, yet they reveal remarkable consistency in the Emperor's thinking. Every scientific breakthrough became valuable only if it increased control, extended survival, or concentrated power in fewer hands. Ethical limits held no meaning inside that equation. Success alone determined whether research continued. For ordinary Imperial scientists, this environment created a strange contradiction. Figures like Galen Erso entered Imperial service because they believed knowledge could improve civilization or unlock the mysteries of energy itself. Engineers dreamed of solving technical challenges rather than building instruments of terror. Medical specialists often pursued genuine advances in human physiology before discovering how their work would be redirected. The Empire rarely recruited only through coercion. It also attracted brilliant minds with resources unavailable anywhere else in the galaxy. By the time many understood the true purpose of their research, walking away had become nearly impossible. Death Trooper equipment reflected this marriage between scientific innovation and military necessity. Their helmets incorporated multi-spectrum vision capable of adapting rapidly to changing environments. Integrated tactical displays reduced the need for external communications, while encrypted systems protected battlefield coordination from interception. Environmental sealing allowed operations under hazardous conditions that would challenge standard infantry. Specialized targeting assistance improved accuracy during both short and long-range engagements. Every improvement appears incremental when viewed separately. Combined together, they produced soldiers whose effectiveness exceeded the sum of their individual components. A quiet but revealing detail emerges whenever Death Troopers enter confined spaces. Unlike ordinary stormtroopers who sometimes rely upon shouted commands during chaotic engagements, Death Troopers often communicate without visible interruption to their movement. The encrypted systems inside their helmets permit constant information exchange while preserving silence for everyone else nearby. One operative identifies a threat before anyone speaks aloud. Another adjusts position after receiving data invisible to outside observers. The squad behaves almost like a single organism whose members share awareness through technology rather than instinct alone. Coordination replaces improvisation. Some fans have wondered whether Death Troopers represented the Empire's first true attempt at creating super soldiers. Canon does not make that claim, and it is worth resisting the temptation to go beyond the evidence. What canon does establish is substantial enough. They were among the Empire's most physically capable human operators. They received enhancements unavailable to conventional forces. They carried equipment reserved for elite assignments and protected projects considered essential to Palpatine's rule. Whether they marked the beginning of an even more ambitious program remains unanswered. The mystery itself is part of what continues to fascinate readers and viewers alike. As laboratories hummed beneath hidden mountains, inside orbital research stations, and deep within secure Imperial compounds, the galaxy above remained largely unaware that these experiments were taking place at all. Citizens saw white armored patrols, star destroyers, and TIE fighters crossing familiar skies. They rarely saw the scientists, physicians, engineers, and intelligence officers quietly expanding the Empire's capabilities behind sealed blast doors. The Death Troopers emerged from that unseen world, not as accidents nor as legends, but as carefully engineered expressions of Palpatine's belief that absolute power belonged to those willing to reshape both machines and people until nothing imperfect remained. Why did the Death Troopers seem to fade from history after the Battle of Yavin, despite surviving one of the Empire's most secretive eras? At first glance, it appears as though they simply vanished when the first Death Star exploded above Yavin 4 in 0 BBY. Yet the Empire itself did not collapse with that station. Thousands of star destroyers remained in service. Sector governors continued enforcing Imperial law. The Imperial Security Bureau still operated from Coruscant, while Darth Vader immediately began hunting those responsible for the station's destruction. An organization built around secrecy rarely disappears because the public stops seeing it. More often, it simply returns to the shadows where it began. The destruction of the Death Star created consequences extending far beyond military losses. Grand Moff Wilhuff. Tarkin died aboard the battle station, removing one of Emperor Palpatine's most influential governors and the principal architect of the doctrine of fear through overwhelming force. Project Stardust, after decades of construction, had failed within days of becoming operational. Imperial confidence suffered its first truly public wound. Rebel recruitment increased as worlds realized that the Empire could, in fact, be defeated. Under those circumstances, protecting classified personnel and strategic research became even more important than before. The remaining Death Troopers had no shortage of work. Canon quietly reinforces this point through later appearances. In The Mandalorian, set approximately 5 years after the Battle of Endor, Moff Gideon commands detachments of Death Troopers, despite the formal collapse of the Galactic Empire. Their armor retains the familiar black finish, their encrypted communications remain intact, and their battlefield discipline appears unchanged. Gideon himself is no ordinary surviving officer. Before the Empire's defeat, he served within the Imperial Security Bureau, precisely the kind of institution that regularly intersected with classified operations and elite security forces. His access to Death Troopers suggests that remnants of the old command structure survived longer than many citizens realized. Gideon's priorities also echo the earlier Imperial obsession with secrecy. Rather than attempting to rebuild the Empire through massive, conventional fleets, he concentrates on carefully protected research, hidden facilities, intelligence gathering, and biological experimentation connected with Force-sensitive blood. His cruiser carries advanced equipment unavailable to ordinary warlords. His laboratories remain concealed until discovered by outside intervention. Even after the Emperor's apparent death over Endor, the habits of Imperial black operations endure. The Death Troopers fit naturally into that environment because they had always been designed for exactly these kinds of missions. Why would an Imperial remnant preserve elite bodyguards instead of expanding ordinary infantry? The answer lies partly in mathematics and partly in psychology. Following the Battle of Endor in 4 ABY, surviving Imperial commanders no longer possessed the industrial capacity that once supplied endless stormtrooper legions. Shipyards fell to the New Republic, recruitment networks fractured, supply lines became increasingly unreliable. Under those conditions, investing resources into a relatively small number of exceptionally capable operators offered greater value than attempting to replace entire armies. A handful of elite soldiers could protect a crucial laboratory, escort a senior commander, or secure sensitive cargo far more effectively than dozens of poorly trained recruits. The Death Troopers accompanying Gideon demonstrate that continuity. During the rescue of the child, Grogu, they defend their commander aboard his light cruiser with the same calm precision displayed years earlier around Director Krennic. They advance methodically through narrow corridors instead of rushing recklessly toward danger. Their communications remain encrypted. Their weapons handling reflects disciplined repetition rather than emotional aggression. Although the Empire has lost Coruscant, the Imperial Senate, and the throne itself, these soldiers behave as though none of those political changes matter. Their loyalty belongs to the mission immediately before them. Another subtle detail deserves attention. Gideon's Death Troopers operate alongside a completely different experimental force, the Dark Troopers. Canon distinguishes these two formations very carefully. Death Troopers are enhanced human soldiers wearing advanced armor. Dark Troopers, during the events of The Mandalorian, are fully mechanical, third-generation combat droids developed after earlier iterations explored during previous Imperial weapons programs. Gideon employs both because each solves a different problem. Human judgment and adaptability remain valuable. Mechanical strength and relentless endurance offer different advantages altogether. The Empire never believed one solution rendered every other unnecessary. That distinction also helps separate canon from older Legends material. In the Star Wars Legends continuity, the term Death Trooper sometimes referred to an entirely different concept involving biological experimentation and even undead Imperial soldiers in the novel Death Troopers. Those stories belong to the separate Legends timeline rather than current Disney canon. The modern canon presents Death Troopers consistently as elite human special forces enhanced through classified Imperial programs, not supernatural creations or zombies. Keeping those continuities distinct prevents confusion because the shared name masks dramatically different origins and purposes. Could surviving Death Troopers have continued serving other Imperial remnant leaders beyond Gideon? Canon leaves room for that possibility without confirming individual cases. After Endor, numerous Imperial factions scattered across the Outer Rim and unknown regions. Some followed figures such as Rey Sloane before later developments surrounding the First Order. Others became isolated warlords, defending shrinking territories. Still others disappeared into deep space under secret contingency plans established by Palpatine himself. Given the Death Troopers' specialized role protecting high-value personnel and classified operations, it is entirely reasonable that surviving detachments remained attached to whichever commands preserved those priorities. There is another reason these soldiers leave so little trace in the historical record. Historians naturally focus upon fleet engagements, planetary campaigns, famous commanders, and decisive political events. Elite security details rarely receive chapters in official histories unless something goes catastrophically wrong. If a Death Trooper unit successfully protected an Imperial archive for 10 years, there would be almost nothing dramatic to record. Their greatest victories often consisted of preventing stories from ever existing. In that sense, obscurity became evidence that they had performed their duties exactly as intended. Imagine once more the long corridors inside an Imperial cruiser after the Empire's glory has begun to fade. Maintenance crews grow fewer. Star destroyers receive repairs more slowly than before. Supply shortages quietly appear where abundance once existed. Yet at the entrance to a sealed laboratory or command center, the same black armor still catches the faint green glow of status lights, and the same encrypted voices murmur through helmet speakers, incomprehensible to everyone else. Empires rise and fall, but institutions built upon secrecy often survive long after banners have changed, carrying old habits into uncertain futures, where yesterday's hidden soldiers continue guarding tomorrow's unknown plans. Why did the Empire repeatedly create new elite forces instead of relying on the Death Troopers alone? Looking across Imperial history, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Death Troopers guarded classified personnel and installations. Purge Troopers hunted surviving Jedi alongside the Inquisitors. Dark Troopers pursued a completely different path through advanced combat droid technology. Emperor Palpatine never searched for a single perfect military solution because he believed every battlefield demanded a specialized instrument. Diversity, not uniformity, became one of the hidden strengths of the Imperial war machine. The Purge Troopers illustrate this philosophy particularly well. Introduced in canon through Jedi, Fallen Order, and later appearing in Obi-Wan Kenobi, these soldiers served the Inquisitorius rather than conventional military commands. Their primary mission involved hunting surviving Jedi in the years following Order 66. Unlike Death Troopers, who emphasized classified security and protective operations, Purge Troopers trained specifically to confront lightsaber-wielding opponents. They carried electrostaffs capable of resisting lightsaber strikes and specialized equipment designed around anti-Jedi tactics. The Empire understood that fighting former members of the Jedi Order required preparation, unlike any ordinary battlefield assignment. The Dark Troopers moved even farther away from traditional military doctrine. Earlier Imperial experiments explored human-operated powered armor, but by the third-generation Dark Troopers seen in The Mandalorian, Gideon had abandoned human pilots entirely. These imposing droids possessed immense physical strength, heavy armor plating, integrated rocket propulsion, and no biological weaknesses that could be exploited through fear or exhaustion. Luke Skywalker's assault aboard Gideon's cruiser demonstrates just how formidable they had become. Blaster fire barely slowed them. Explosions failed to destroy them easily. Only a Jedi Master wielding the Force and a lightsaber cut through them with consistent efficiency. Why did Palpatine never replace all stormtroopers with these more advanced forces? The answer lies in the practical realities of ruling an entire galaxy. The Empire governed millions of inhabited worlds spread across thousands of sectors, occupying cities, guarding checkpoints, escorting convoys, policing trade routes, and manning enormous star destroyers required staggering numbers of personnel. Elite soldiers demanded extraordinary training, expensive equipment, and years of investment. Dark Troopers required sophisticated manufacturing and maintenance. Ordinary stormtroopers, by comparison, could be recruited, trained, and deployed in far greater numbers. Quantity remained indispensable, even inside an empire fascinated by quality. The Imperial Navy followed a remarkably similar philosophy. Massive Imperial-class star destroyers formed the backbone of fleet power, projecting authority across entire sectors. Yet they operated alongside Arquitens-class light cruisers, Gozanti transports, Raider-class corvettes, interdictor cruisers equipped with gravity well generators and specialized support vessels performing roles no star destroyer could accomplish efficiently. Palpatine consistently rejected one-size-fits-all solutions. Whether discussing warships, intelligence agencies, or elite soldiers, he preferred overlapping capabilities that compensated for one another's weaknesses. Redundancy increased resilience. The Death Troopers occupied a distinctive position inside this broader military ecosystem because they combined flexibility with secrecy. Unlike Purge Troopers, they could operate against ordinary opponents as effectively as extraordinary ones. Unlike Dark Troopers, they retained human judgment during unpredictable situations. Unlike conventional stormtroopers, they possessed equipment and training appropriate for independent action around high-value individuals. Their versatility made them valuable precisely because they did not belong exclusively to one narrow battlefield niche. They adapted to classified circumstances wherever those circumstances emerged. Another revealing comparison involves the Emperor's Royal Guard. The crimson-robed sentinels stationed near Palpatine during Return of the Jedi appear almost ceremonial at first glance, standing silently beside the Imperial throne aboard the second Death Star. Canon, however, establishes that these guards received exceptional combat training and absolute loyalty screening before entering service. Their mission differed fundamentally from that of the Death Troopers. The Royal Guard protected the Emperor himself. Death Troopers protected the Emperor's secrets. One defended the ruler, the other defended the machinery that sustained his rule. Why did so many of these organizations remain compartmentalized instead of working together constantly? From a modern military perspective, closer integration might appear more efficient. From Palpatine's perspective, compartmentalization reduced the danger of conspiracy. A Death Trooper commander knew little about cloning research on Mount Tantus. Scientists on Exegol did not oversee ISB investigations on Ferrix. The Inquisitorius pursued surviving Jedi without requiring access to Project Stardust. If one organization suffered infiltration, capture, or destruction, the others continued functioning with minimal disruption. Secrecy itself became another defensive layer. This system also reflected the Emperor's deeply personal worldview. As Darth Sidious, Palpatine spent decades manipulating allies who never realized they were being manipulated. He trusted information only when he controlled its movement personally. Apprentices learned only fragments of larger plans. Imperial governors knew only enough to govern their assigned sectors. Military officers received operational orders without always understanding strategic objectives. Even Darth Vader occasionally discovered elements of Palpatine's long-term ambitions only after they had already begun unfolding. Control depended upon limiting knowledge as much as distributing authority. There's a fascinating irony hidden inside this structure. Every specialized Imperial organization became exceptionally good at its own mission. Death Troopers mastered protective operations. The ISB refined surveillance. Imperial intelligence cultivated espionage networks. The Navy perfected large-scale fleet warfare. Yet because each institution remained partially isolated, none possessed a complete understanding of the empire they served. Palpatine alone stood at the center where every thread converged. His death at Endor therefore created consequences that no subordinate organization could fully compensate for. Remove the single figure connecting the network, and the network gradually unraveled. Viewed this way, the Death Troopers become something larger than elite bodyguards dressed in black armor. They represent the Imperial belief that every problem could be solved by constructing another carefully controlled institution hidden behind classified clearances and encrypted communications. Every new threat inspired another specialized response. Every success justified another layer of secrecy. Over time, the Empire became a maze of overlapping commands, hidden laboratories, restricted archives, and silent soldiers who rarely appeared in public because the Emperor believed the most important battles should never be visible until they had already been won. Picture once more those encrypted voices murmuring beneath featureless black helmets as a transport glides through hyperspace toward another unnamed destination. Somewhere else, crimson-robed guards stand motionless beside the Emperor's throne. On another world, ISB analysts study intercepted transmissions. In a hidden laboratory, scientists continue work that only a handful of officials understand. None of these people see the entire design. Only when you step back and view them together does the full shape of Imperial black operations begin to emerge, revealing an empire built not merely on armies and starships, but on carefully separated secrets that rarely allowed one another to meet Why did the Empire ultimately lose the galactic civil war, despite possessing the galaxy's most sophisticated intelligence services, elite special forces, and overwhelming military resources? It is one of the central paradoxes of Star Wars history. By every conventional measurement, Emperor Palpatine commanded advantages no previous galactic government had ever assembled. The Imperial Navy controlled thousands of capital ships, the Imperial Army and Stormtrooper corps stretched across countless sectors. The ISB monitored internal dissent, while Imperial intelligence gathered information far beyond Imperial borders. Specialized formations such as the Death Troopers guarded the regime's most valuable assets with extraordinary professionalism. Yet within little more than 2 decades of its founding, the Empire began to fracture. The Battle of Endor in 4 ABY marked the decisive turning point. Emperor Palpatine chose the forest moon as the location for the second Death Star's completion, believing he could lure the Rebel Alliance into a carefully prepared trap. The Imperial fleet waited under the command of Admiral Firmus Payet, while the battle station itself remained protected by a planetary shield generator located on Endor's surface. Darth Vader accompanied Luke Skywalker aboard the unfinished station, where Palpatine intended to complete his long effort to turn the son of Anakin Skywalker to the dark side. Every element appeared coordinated. Every layer of defense seemed complete. Once again, the Empire looked invincible. The shield generator itself reflected the same philosophy that had protected Scarif years earlier. Rather than relying solely upon the Death Star's own weapons, Imperial planners established a separate ground installation connected to orbit through a massive energy shield. General Veers had demonstrated during the Battle of Hoth that shield systems could dramatically complicate planetary assaults, and Endor expanded that principle further. Imperial bunker complexes housed troops, armored vehicles, and defensive emplacements designed to repel sabotage attempts. Scout troopers patrolled the surrounding forests aboard speeder bikes. Stormtroopers secured the installation while officers coordinated operations from hardened command centers. The Empire anticipated direct attack and prepared accordingly. Why then did the shield generator fall? The answer exposes one weakness that elite soldiers alone could never eliminate. Han Solo's strike team reached the bunker not through overwhelming military force, but through deception, improvisation, and local alliances. Leia, Organa, Chewbacca, Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, and Rebel commandos benefited from unexpected assistance by the Ewoks, whose intimate knowledge of the moon's forests transformed primitive traps into effective weapons against technologically superior opponents. TST walkers became vulnerable in dense woodland. Scout trooper patrols struggled against enemies appearing and disappearing among ancient trees. Imperial doctrine excelled against predictable threats. Endor offered almost nothing predictable. Even had Death Troopers been assigned to portions of the Endor operation, they could not have altered its central problem. Their expertise lay in protecting high-value individuals, classified facilities, and carefully controlled environments. Endor descended into decentralized chaos across dozens of separate engagements unfolding simultaneously. Communications faltered, local commanders adapted independently, unexpected variables multiplied by the minute. Elite units can stabilize portions of a battlefield, but they cannot compensate indefinitely when an entire strategic framework begins collapsing around them. Endor became precisely that kind of battle. Above the forest moon, events unfolded with equal speed. Admiral Akbar recognized that the Death Star's operational status had been concealed from rebel intelligence until the fleet emerged from hyperspace. The Imperial Star Destroyers closed ranks while the battle station opened fire, destroying rebel capital ships with terrifying efficiency. Yet Lando Calrissian, flying the Millennium Falcon, realized that the incomplete superstructure contained access routes impossible on the finished first Death Star. Once the planetary shield failed, rebel starfighters entered the station itself rather than attacking its exterior. History repeated itself in an unexpected form. The Empire's greatest weapon again became vulnerable from within. At the center of all these battles stood Palpatine himself. For decades, he had believed that careful planning allowed him to anticipate every meaningful possibility. That confidence served him remarkably well during the fall of the Republic, the execution of Order 66, and the consolidation of Imperial authority. Endor proved different because one crucial variable refused to obey calculation. Darth Vader, once Anakin Skywalker, chose compassion for his son over loyalty to his Sith master. No intelligence report could predict that decision. No surveillance network could prevent it. No elite security formation could reverse it after it occurred. This is where the limits of Imperial black operations become clearest. The ISB could monitor conversations, Death Troopers could defend laboratories, Imperial intelligence could infiltrate rebel cells. Scientists could engineer stronger armor and more powerful weapons. None of those institutions possessed the ability to control conscience itself. The Empire excelled at shaping external behavior through fear. It never fully understood the internal choices that individuals continued making, even under extraordinary pressure. Galen Erso secretly sabotaged the Death Star. Bodhi Rook defected despite serving the Empire. Agent Callus eventually rejected Imperial ideology after years inside the ISB's orbit. Vader himself returned to the light in his final moments. The Empire repeatedly lost, not because it lacked force, but because it misunderstood loyalty. What became of the Death Troopers immediately after Endor remains largely unrecorded in canon, and that silence feels entirely appropriate given their role. Unlike famous admirals or celebrated rebel heroes, they were never intended to become public symbols. Surviving detachments almost certainly followed whichever legitimate command structures still functioned in the confusion after the Emperor's death. Some likely withdrew with organized Imperial fleets. Others protected classified facilities, awaiting further orders that never came. Still others may have entered the service of regional commanders struggling to preserve fragments of Imperial authority. Their anonymity, paradoxically, becomes the strongest evidence that they continued fulfilling the purpose for which they had always existed. The gradual collapse of centralized Imperial government only increased the importance of whatever classified assets remained. Secret archives still required protection. Research installations still contained dangerous technology. Intelligence records documenting informants and covert operations could not simply be abandoned. Commanders escaping into the unknown regions under Palpatine's contingency carried sensitive information whose loss threatened future plans. Elite security forces retained practical value even after conventional front lines disappeared. Empires may collapse dramatically in public memory, but administrative structures often dissolve much more slowly behind closed doors. So the story of the Death Troopers never truly ends with the destruction of one battle station or the death of one emperor. Their black armor belonged to a philosophy that stretched across the entire Imperial era, a belief that every priceless secret deserved guardians who would remain almost invisible until the precise moment they were needed. As worlds celebrated liberation after Endor and monuments to the Empire fell across the galaxy, somewhere beyond those celebrations, silent transports still crossed the stars carrying soldiers whose names history would never preserve, guarding the last locked doors of a government that had already begun passing into legend. Why do the Death Troopers still command such fascination when they appear so briefly across Star Wars canon? Part of the answer lies in how carefully their appearances were chosen. They are never presented as ordinary soldiers filling the background of every Imperial operation. Instead, they arrive beside figures such as Director Orson Krennic or Moff Gideon at moments when the audience immediately senses that the stakes have become unusually high. Their rarity becomes part of their identity. Like Darth Vader himself, they lose none of their impact through overuse because the story never allows them to become commonplace. Their visual design reinforces that impression with remarkable discipline. Standard stormtrooper armor reflects light, making formations highly visible as symbols of Imperial authority. Death Trooper armor behaves almost the opposite way. Glossy black surfaces absorb the dim illumination of hangars, laboratories, and Star Destroyer corridors until only sharp edges and green status lights remain visible. Their helmets retain the familiar stormtrooper profile while introducing subtle changes that suggest more sophisticated sensors and internal systems. The result feels immediately recognizable yet distinctly unsettling, as though the familiar image of Imperial order has evolved into something colder and more secretive. Sound contributes just as much as appearance. Ben Burtt's original sound design helped define Star Wars through instantly recognizable audio signatures, from TIE fighter engines to lightsaber ignition. The Death Troopers continue that tradition by speaking through encrypted digital processing rather than ordinary helmet microphones. Canon explains that these transmissions protect operational security, preventing unauthorized listeners from understanding battlefield communications. On a storytelling level, however, the effect reaches further. You hear voices, yet they remain inaccessible, reminding you that these soldiers inhabit a world of classified information from which everyone else has been excluded. Why did Lucasfilm choose to introduce the Death Troopers specifically through Rogue One rather than another story? The answer fits naturally with the film's themes. Rogue One revolves around intelligence work, espionage, sabotage, hidden messages, and carefully protected secrets rather than the heroic destiny that defines much of the Skywalker saga. Cassian Andor begins the film carrying out covert assassinations for the Rebel Alliance. Bodhi Rook defects by secretly transporting information. Galen Erso hides a fatal weakness inside the Death Star's design. The entire narrative depends upon knowledge passing quietly between individuals before exploding into history. Death Troopers embody the Imperial side of that same invisible conflict. Their influence extends beyond individual scenes, because they broaden the audience's understanding of the Empire itself. Before Rogue One, many viewers naturally imagined the Imperial military as a fairly straightforward hierarchy composed of officers, stormtroopers, walkers, TIE fighters, and star destroyers. Canon had always hinted at greater complexity through organizations such as Imperial Intelligence, but the Death Troopers gave physical form to those hidden layers. Suddenly, the Empire felt deeper, with classified branches operating beneath its already enormous public institutions. One new unit quietly suggested an entire unseen world existing just beyond the edges of familiar stories. This layered approach reflects George Lucas's original philosophy surprisingly well. Even in the earliest films, countless details implied histories never fully explained. Obi-Wan Kenobi casually mentioned the Clone Wars long before audiences knew what they were. The Imperial Senate existed in dialogue before viewers ever witnessed it. The Kessel Run became famous decades before Solo finally depicted portions of it on screen. Modern canon continues that tradition by introducing organizations whose complete histories remain only partially illuminated. The Death Troopers feel authentic because they invite curiosity instead of exhausting it. It is also worth recognizing what canon deliberately avoids saying. No official source provides biographies for most Death Trooper operatives. We do not learn their homeworlds, childhoods, or personal ambitions. Individual names rarely matter because the institution intentionally suppresses individuality. This absence is not a flaw in the storytelling. It mirrors the Empire's own objective. A perfect classified operative becomes almost interchangeable with the mission itself, leaving only performance behind while personal history quietly disappears. Of course, fans naturally try to fill those empty spaces. Some imagine former clone veterans surviving into the Imperial era and earning positions among elite units, though canon does not identify Death Troopers as clone formations. Others speculate that especially successful Imperial Academy graduates from Carida or similar institutions eventually entered the program after years of exemplary service. Still, others wonder whether surviving members quietly transitioned into the First Order decades later. None of these possibilities have received definitive canonical confirmation. They remain engaging theories precisely because the established facts leave room for thoughtful discussion without contradiction. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Death Troopers lies not in battles won or enemies defeated, but in the atmosphere they create whenever they appear. You immediately understand that ordinary rules no longer apply. Conversations become quieter, corridors seem longer. Even experienced Imperial officers stand a little straighter when black-armored figures enter the room. The audience instinctively recognizes that these soldiers guard information rather than territory, and information often proves far more dangerous than blaster fire. Few military designs communicate so much before a single shot is fired. There is a quiet irony hidden within their story. The Empire devoted enormous effort to ensuring that these soldiers would leave almost no trace behind them. Classified assignments remained classified. Successful missions generated little publicity. Individual achievements disappeared into sealed archives. Yet, outside the fictional galaxy, they have become one of the most recognizable elite formations in modern Star Wars. The very anonymity that defined them inside the Empire became the quality that made audiences remember them most vividly. Now the transport from our opening waits once again in perfect silence between the stars. The engines continue their steady vibration through the hull, while green indicator lights reflect across polished black helmets. Encrypted voices murmur softly through secure channels, incomprehensible to anyone standing outside the unit. Somewhere beyond the sealed hatch lies another classified facility, another secret archive, another Imperial official whose survival has been judged essential to the Emperor's designs. History will remember the destruction of battle stations, the victories of rebel heroes, and the fall of tyrants. But behind many of those familiar events stood silent guardians whose greatest success was ensuring that almost no one ever learned they had been there at all. Why does the story of the Death Troopers still matter after the Empire has fallen, the Death Stars are gone, and the galactic civil war has passed into history? The answer reaches beyond any single battle or commander. These soldiers represent one of the clearest expressions of how Emperor Palpatine ruled the galaxy. He did not rely only upon fleets, laws, or political institutions. He governed through carefully layered secrecy, where information moved only when he allowed it to move, and where every priceless secret stood behind another locked door, guarded by people trained never to ask why. The Death Troopers became living symbols of that philosophy. If you trace their history from beginning to end, a remarkably consistent pattern emerges. They appear around Project Stardust, while the Death Star remains hidden from the Senate and much of the Imperial military. They guard Director Orson Krennic on Lahamu, Eadu, and Scarif as the Empire's greatest engineering achievement approaches completion. They accompany Darth Vader and other senior Imperial figures when classified operations outweigh ordinary military campaigns. Years later, they continue serving Moff Gideon as he protects secret research connected to cloning and Force-sensitive experimentation. Different commanders, different decades, different political circumstances, but always the same purpose: guarding what the Empire considered too dangerous to lose. That consistency is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the Death Troopers were never intended as shock troops in the conventional sense. Stormtroopers occupied cities. Snow troopers crossed the ice fields of Hoth. Scout troopers raced through Endor's forests. Shore troopers defended Scarif's beaches. Death troopers almost always stood where information became more valuable than territory. Laboratories, archive towers, command centers, research installations, high-ranking officials whose knowledge mattered as much as their survival. Their battlefield was often a hallway rather than an open plain. Why does Palpatine's system feel so strangely modern, despite existing in a galaxy of hyperspace travel and ancient Jedi temples? Perhaps because the foundations of his rule remain familiar across history. Every authoritarian government has sought to classify information, monitor dissent, cultivate intelligence networks, and concentrate power within smaller circles of trusted individuals. The Galactic Empire enlarges those ideas to the scale of an entire galaxy, but the underlying principles remain recognizable. Specialized security forces become guardians not merely of leaders, but of systems. Fear becomes administrative as much as military. Silence itself becomes a strategic resource. There is another lesson hidden quietly beneath all the armor and starships. The Empire believed that enough surveillance could eliminate uncertainty. Enough classified programs could overcome every weakness. Enough elite soldiers could secure every vulnerable point. Yet history repeatedly refused to obey that logic. Galen Erso concealed one equation inside an otherwise flawless design. Bodhi Rook carried one message across the stars. Cassian Andor trusted Jyn Erso when circumstances offered little reason for certainty. Luke Skywalker believed there was still good within Darth Vader when nearly everyone else had abandoned that hope. Individual choices repeatedly escaped systems built to predict and control them. That does not diminish the achievement of the Death Troopers themselves. Judged purely as soldiers, canon presents them as exceptionally disciplined professionals who fulfilled extraordinarily difficult assignments. They defended Project Stardust with determination. They protected Imperial leaders under extreme conditions. They mastered equipment and communications unavailable to ordinary infantry. They remained loyal even as the political structure around them slowly weakened. Their record contains remarkably few obvious failures attributable to poor performance. More often, they found themselves serving objectives whose collapse originated far above their own level of responsibility. It is tempting to imagine one final classified archive somewhere beyond the familiar maps of the galaxy, not because canon confirms such a place, but because the Empire consistently prepared contingencies for defeat. Palpatine's contingency sent loyal officers toward the unknown regions after Endor. Exegol remained hidden for decades beyond ordinary hyperspace routes. Mount Tantus concealed scientific work beneath mountains until its discovery. If forgotten storage vaults, encrypted databases, or abandoned command bunkers still drift quietly through the darkness, they fit naturally within the Empire's established habits. Whether Death Troopers ever guarded such places after the Emperor's death remains unanswered. Canon leaves that door deliberately unopened. Legends once explored many different futures for Imperial Special Forces, some involving technologies and organizations that current canon has replaced or reimagined. Those stories remain fascinating as alternate history within the broader Star Wars mythos, but the present canon tells a quieter and, in many ways, more grounded tale. Here, the Death Troopers do not become supernatural beings or unstoppable monsters. They remain highly trained human operators shaped by relentless discipline, advanced equipment, classified enhancement, and absolute secrecy. Their humanity never disappears entirely. The Empire simply tries very hard to hide it beneath armor, encryption, and institutional anonymity. Perhaps that is why they linger in memory. The white armor of ordinary stormtroopers represents the visible Empire. The occupation forces, the checkpoints, the marching formations, the endless displays of authority. The black armor of the Death Troopers represents the invisible Empire, the files no citizen may read, the laboratories hidden behind blast doors, the intelligence reports marked for only a handful of eyes, the conversations spoken through encrypted channels where even language itself becomes classified. One image shows power, the other shows control. Together they explain far more about Palpatine's reign than either could alone. Now the transport from the beginning of our journey drifts once again through the silence between stars. The green indicator above the hatch still burns with quiet certainty, reflecting across polished black helmets exactly as it did before our story began. The engines hum steadily, the encrypted voices murmur softly through hidden receivers, and beyond the sealed doors waits another mission that official history will never record. No medals will celebrate its success. No monument will remember the soldiers standing patiently in the darkness. They remain what the Emperor always intended them to be: unseen guardians of unseen secrets, carrying the weight of an empire whose greatest victories were often the stories no one outside its walls was ever supposed to hear. When you look back across the empire through the quiet footsteps of the Death Troopers, something unexpected begins to emerge. Their story is not really about the finest armor, the most advanced weapons, or the most disciplined soldiers ever produced by Imperial science. It is about a government that slowly convinced itself that every uncertainty could be eliminated if enough doors were locked, enough files classified, and enough silent guardians placed between ordinary people and the truth. Emperor Palpatine believed control was strongest when it became invisible, when fear no longer required speeches because it had already settled into the routines of daily life. You can almost feel that philosophy echo through every hidden laboratory on Iadu, every archive on Scarif, every ISB briefing on Coruscant, and every encrypted transmission whispered behind a black helmet. The Empire did not simply build armies, it built layers of silence. Yet Star Wars has always suggested that silence is never the final word. A moisture farmer on Tatooine, a senator's adopted daughter from Alderaan, a reluctant scientist named Galen Erso, an Imperial pilot named Bodhi Rook, a weary intelligence officer named Cassian Andor, and finally the son of Darth Vader himself, all prove the same quiet truth. History changes because individuals choose differently from what powerful systems expect. The Force itself seems to favor those moments when compassion interrupts certainty, when conscience refuses calculation, and when one person decides that fear no longer deserves obedience. No classified archive can predict that decision. No elite security force can completely prevent it. However perfect the machinery of control becomes, it remains unable to govern the human heart. That is why the Death Troopers remain such compelling figures within the larger saga. They are neither villains driven by cruelty nor tragic heroes seeking redemption. Most of them are simply professionals carrying out duties they have been trained to perform with extraordinary precision. Their discipline is real, their courage is real, their effectiveness is real. The tragedy lies elsewhere, in the purpose they are asked to serve. The finest soldiers in the galaxy devote themselves to protecting a system that ultimately consumes its own creators, destroys entire worlds to preserve its authority, and mistakes obedience for peace. Their excellence becomes another resource spent in service of fear. Perhaps that is the deeper balance hidden beneath this story. The Empire believed that survival depended upon controlling every variable, while the Rebel Alliance survived precisely because it accepted uncertainty. Rebels trusted strangers, improvised impossible plans, and placed hope where probability offered very little encouragement. Again and again, the Imperial system encountered people who acted not according to statistics or doctrine, but according to loyalty, sacrifice, friendship, and love. Those qualities appear fragile when measured beside star destroyers and battle stations, yet they outlast them all. In the end, the Empire possessed almost everything except the one thing it could never manufacture. So as the stars drift quietly beyond the viewport, you find yourself once more inside that silent transport where our journey began. The engines still hum with patient certainty. The green indicator above the hatch still glows against polished black armor, and encrypted voices continue their soft, mechanical whispers through channels no outsider can understand. Somewhere ahead lies another classified mission, another forgotten corridor, another secret waiting to be guarded. But beyond the darkness outside the hull, the galaxy keeps turning toward dawn, carried forward by choices that no encryption can conceal and no empire can ever fully command.